Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get underway. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit, Governance and Standards Committee. Just the housekeeping issues first. I've been advised there are no fire drills planned for tonight, but if the alarm does sound, Mrs. Snook will ascertain the situation and provide further instructions and lead us safely out, I assume. I'd remind you the meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Borough Council website. I don't think I see anybody else who's going to be recording it. No. Members who are using mobile phones or tablets, as you know, are asked to ensure these are on silent, including myself, and are only being used with regard to business on the agenda this evening. Excuse me while I switch mine off. Right. Some members and officers may not be familiar with the new microphones. To speak, you press the middle button. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. Once you finish speaking, please press the middle button again and it will turn white. Okay, let's get on to the agenda. Apologies for absence. I've received apologies for absence from Councillors Fissenden, Garland, Vizard and Mrs. Ryden. Do I have any substitute members? Yes, Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Borson for Councillor Garland.
Thank you. Yes.
Councillor Harvey for Councillor Vizard.
Thank you. Any more? For any more? No. Just a couple of items on the agenda. I've agreed to take the revised report of the Director of Finance and Business Improvement relating to the Treasury Management Strategy 2017 as an urgent item, as the relevant figures for the capital programme and prudential borrowing have been updated as appropriate to align with the capital programme proposals that are being reported to the Policy and Resources Committee on the 18th of January. I've also agreed to take a revised letter from Grant Thornton relating to housing benefits subsidy claims certification work undertaken for the Council for the year ended 31st of March 2016 as an urgent item, as the letter circulated with the agenda was not the final version, it was a draft. So I take it you're all in agreement with doing that. I see no visiting members. Are there any disclosures by members and officers? No. Any disclosures of lobbying? No. I see no exempt information. So let's look at the minutes of the last meeting and go through those. Can we? Everybody got them? Page 1. Page 2. Page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, sorry, yes.
Page 5, we're going to have figures about the 106 distributions which had to be returned to developers. I don't recall seeing that. Are they available? I must have missed that.
Yeah, they have been. Can I just go through the minutes and then we'll go back, because there's a couple of other things on there too that we can just check up on. Okay. So that was, where was I up to? Page 6, page 7 and page 8. So we're happy I can sign those minutes. Okay, thank you. Now, going back to the item you mentioned, Councillor, I believe that has been circulated, the, sorry, where are we? The S106 contributions. I've got a paper that was delivered to me, I think, today. You haven't seen it? Has anybody else seen it?
Yeah. Yes, Mr. Chairman, but it did come out either late yesterday evening or early this morning, so those people who've been at work wouldn't have seen it.
Okay, well, we'll make sure this is circulated then if you haven't already got it. Yes.
May I just ask that that will be to the parish representatives as well? Parish council? Okay, thank you.
Yes. Anybody else have any other matters arising from the minutes?
It's just an inquiry. There is a commitment for an initiative that, Chairman, you proposed, and I believe I supported, that we should take a look at the governance aspects of, I think it was 8 to 10 of the major contracts. I'm just wondering, is there any sort of timetable on that?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, there was a paper that actually went alongside the Section 106 information, which I'm assuming if you've not seen one, you won't have seen the other. But that listed the 10 largest contracts by value and gave our most recent audit view of each, with some commentary on when they were due to be next examined if they hadn't been looked at recently.
So, shall we arrange to circulate that as well to all members? Okay, let's move on the agenda then. Item 8, report of the interim head of legal partnership, complaints received under the members' code of conduct, on page 9. And I gather, Donna, you're going to deal with this. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the 4th monitoring officer update on complaints received under the members' code of conduct. The majority of the initial part of the report covers is the same as the last report, and the new information is in points 2.6 to 2.9. Since the last report, on the 19th of September, there have been 3 new complaints. 2 of those related to borough councillors and 1 related to a parish councillor. As of the 5th of January, 1 of those complaints was in the initial assessment stage, 1 was not progressed as it failed the legal jurisdiction test, and 1 was not progressed because it failed the local assessment criteria. And the update on the 2 complaints that were outstanding on the last report both have been found to be, or 1 to be no breach, and 1 was not progressed as it failed the local assessment criteria. There has still been no cause to call a hearing subcommittee, unless there's any questions.
Are we allowed to ask whether it's the parish or a borough one that is still a recalcitrant possibility?
Well, you can ask and we'll see if we get an answer.
It's the parish one, and it's only because it's the newest one. It came over the Christmas period.
Yes, Councillor English.
Not a question, but an observation, Mr. Chairman. Many members, parish and borough, will remember when the Code of Conduct first came in, and the torrent of complaints there were, and mostly unjustified. And it's interesting that it's dwindled to this trickle. Whether or not it indicates that we're all doing very well, I'm not sure. But on the surface, it would seem to indicate that Maidstone Borough Council and parishes are paragons of probity.
May I ask, Donna, do we hear at this committee? Do we hear at this committee all of the complaints that come in?
All of the complaints that come in are reported. So that is, we have only had 3 complaints made to us since the last report.
That you report, and you report them to the committee?
All
I mean, you don't get ones that
reported.
come in that are frivolous and you just discount them, we never hear about those?
No, they're all in the report.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any more to say on that? No? Thank you very much, and we look forward to the next clean report. Okay. We're asked on page 9 to note the contents of report. Can I put that down as noted? Thank you very much. Okay. Moving on to page 13 and the report of the Head of Revenue and Benefits, Housing Benefit Grant Claim. I believe, Liz, you're going to handle this?
Yes, this is to do with the annual report of the Housing Benefit Grant Claim, and actually I'm pleased to report that there's no amendments or qualifications in this instance.
Okay. Has everybody got the revised letter, or at least had a look at it? Yes. And does anybody want to raise any points on it? Councillor English.
I just think it should be mentioned how unusual, relatively unusual it is in local government for such a report on such an area to be unqualified. I've pressed it several times. It is. That's why, but there we go, it's off now. It's not common for an unqualified report to come forward. It's notable that both Maidstone and I believe Tunbridge Wells in our area have both had unqualified reports, and that is something officers and indeed our auditors and advisors should be complimented on. I just thought that needed to be said.
And very worthily said it was, if I may say so. Congratulations to the officers concerned. Thank you. Okay, so on page 13, we're asked to note the Grant Thornton assurance that the Council maintains a strong control environment for the preparation and monitoring of grant claims and returns. Can I take that as noted? Thank you. Okay, moving on to the budget strategy and the risk assessment. Who's going to be dealing with this? Will you deal with this? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As members know, the service committees are currently considering budget proposals from officers this month prior to Policy and Resources Committee putting forward a draft budget for consideration by Council on the 1st of March. And the role of your committee in this is to consider risks associated with the budget process, and that's what this report is doing. The way that we've gone about this is to prepare a risk register, which is included as an appendix to this report. And the various risks that we've identified are then evaluated. And this is summarised on page 24 of the report, if you care to turn to that. And what this does is plot out the various risks, which are labelled A through to M, on a risk matrix on two dimensions, the likelihood of the risk materialising and the impact. And this is the kind of format that you've seen previously when we've presented risk registers to this committee. Now, looking at the evaluation that we've carried out, you'll see that we see the biggest risk around the budget process as being a J, as to whether savings can actually be delivered in practice. And there are around 3.2 million worth of savings that have been put forward over the next 5 years. So clearly that's quite a substantial amount. So there's a risk both to do with the scale of the risks and also the fact that any savings mean changes to the way that we do business. And just to point out that when it's talking about delivery of planned savings, that the savings there are encompassing all the budget proposals that have been put forward. So some of those could be about increased income as well as cuts in expenditure. There's a bit of an overlap there between the increased income that will generate a saving and other risks that we've identified here about fees and charges and commercialisation. But I think it's worth focusing on the new income that's represented by those budget savings. So that's the area where we see the biggest risk, but a whole lot of different risks that we've identified. And what we'd be grateful if you members could do is consider the risk assessment, the different risks that we've put forward, whether you feel there's anything that we've missed out, and also to comment on the evaluation that we've carried out of those risks and whether you feel that we've got it about right. I should finally say that although there are a whole lot of risks here, and particularly the risk around delivery of savings, there are mitigations that we will put in place against those risks, and that's the whole point about this type of exercise. You identify the risk and then you think about what you can do to mitigate it. So with the risk around delivery of savings, the kind of mitigations that we would have, first of all, make sure that the savings are planned and implemented carefully, and then as they're implemented, that we monitor them and report on how we're doing against delivery of the savings to members. So the process of risk identification will lead on to steps to mitigate those risks. So members, be very grateful for your comments on the register and the evaluation of risks. Thank you.
Councillor Daly.
Chairman, these risk assessments on an annual basis, follow a pattern, as far as I'm concerned anyway, and there are slight variations year on year based on a whole raft of different aspects that we have to take into account. Looking at what I call the traffic light indicator on page 24, obviously we want to keep out of the black, which is unusual. We're trying to always keep in the black, aren't we? And the red, one thing. But the major part of this is in the amber area. And there are 2 or 3 items in there which are out of our control altogether. But they do impinge on us, or could impinge on us, if certain things go wrong elsewhere. And the one that strikes me straight away is D, changes in government economic strategy, if they ever had one. I can be cynical about that, can't I? But a change in the economic strategy, and relative to Brexit, for example, could throw us completely off track. And those are one of the risks that we can't really do much about. I don't think we could even get insurance for it, even if we wanted to. So I look at these fees and charges as another one, of course, where we are not necessarily allowed to increase our fees and charges by, again, interference from central government. We can't raise council tax to do specific things unless we go out to a whole raft of consultation, which cost far more, perhaps, than we would be raising anyway. So there are those risks also that we are, as it were, nailed down because of the way in which we're dictated to from outside. So I see all these areas, which are quite important areas, all in that mismos part of the strategy, risk strategy. We can't do much about it. It's certainly not moving towards green, and we have to accept it, unfortunately. So I take this as being accurate for the time being. I have to. And just pray that we are going to see outcomes as predicted. But as I say, we can't predict some of these things because they're not in our hands. And I'm not, as I say, even sure that the people who are imposing these things on us are sure themselves either.
Thank you for that, Councillor. I must say I do find this traffic light presentation very helpful in terms of homing in on the things that you have. I just wonder whether, Mark, you got a response to any of what the Councillor has said.
No, I would agree that those are very significant risks for us, and I'm glad you agree with the evaluation of the risks that we've made. The important thing for us as a council is to look at what we can do to mitigate those. Certainly, so far as government economic policy is concerned, we've built some provision into the strategic revenue projections to try and allow for what might happen after 2020. We have a four-year funding settlement from the government at the moment, which takes us through to 1920, which gives us a bit of certainty, but really we're in completely new territory after the end of those 4 years in 1920, and that's really where we're exposed to that risk of the government changing their approach. I agree with you.
Councillor Borton, you indicated.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was going to raise the same points as Councillor Daly. To me, it's the traffic, and I agree with you as well. The traffic light system is very helpful because I was drawn immediately to D, F, and J, being those most likely to happen, and D caught my eye straight away. If I'm being really pedantic, perhaps I'd put the impact as maybe in that red territory somewhat, because as Councillor Daly very eloquently articulated, this is something that we don't quite know about yet. Certainly we might get a bit more indication at the budgets, the government budgets towards the end of March, beginning of April, but we just don't know. And then looking on page 26, obviously the medium-term financial strategy is a key existing control, but frankly, in the grand scheme of things, it can only do so much, ultimately. So no, really, just to echo what Councillor Daly said, I'm not going to die in a ditch over what the officers have put on the table here. It's clearly well researched and makes some very balanced recommendations ultimately. And we are in uncharted territory, to an extent with Brexit and whatnot. So we're just going to have to see how it goes, I think, and watch this cautiously.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm sure officers will be doing that constantly. Councillor Cooling, did you indicate?
Happy for Councillor Cooling to go first.
There's
Councillor Perry before Councillor English too. I've got it, so you go ahead.
Okay. Very, very kind. Yes, very helpful layout. But I think we need to take a view of whether these are judgments on risk before the draft 5-year plan was put together, or whether it's a chart judging residual risk after the judgments and stamps that our financial colleagues have put. It looks to me as if this should be read as a view of risks before the our financial colleagues have made their various allowances, judgments and so on. Because if the residual risks are such as this, then we may want to look at the 5-year plan again to take a more judicious stance. So are these before or after finance has taken a view of the subject?
Are you suggesting that the level of risk is rather worrying for you?
I would say that the level of... I don't want to use the word worrying, but put it this way, I'd be far more interested in this chart, far more concerned about this chart, if it were a view of the residual risks surrounding the budget that has been put forward, rather than if it was a view of the risks before the officers did their professional best to come out with strategies and decisions to address many of the risks.
It's based on the residual risk after we've taken account of all of the things in the medium-term financial strategy.
In that case, I am more concerned than I otherwise would have been, but if I could perhaps expand on that, because I can see at least 2 items in here, perhaps A and B and H, which are consequences of risks crystallising for the other items. So it strikes me that in this chart, which is very helpful, I just wonder whether we should have the sources of risk left in the table, because the consequences of risk are A, B, and H.
Can you clarify your question, Mr. Cooling?
Clive, you have a go.
You can correct me if I got this wrong, is alluding to to the reassessment that would be needed should the council choose to take some very risky decisions and overturn some of its long-term policy objectives in terms of borrowing limits, balance limits, and also take a Liverpool or a Lambeth approach to budget setting. If you remember the attempts to set deficit budgets, and also clearly if the council chose to do those sort of things, the whole document would need reassessment.
Will I come back? Thank you for the clarification. If that's what you were getting at, Mr. Gilling, certainly it's the case that taking a different approach to what's in the medium-term financial strategy could easily increase the level of risk that we're facing, because within the medium-term financial strategy there's some quite specific proposals for things that we can do to close the budget gap. If you were to say, oh, well, we don't need to do those things, then that would, in my view, increase the risk levels that are shown in this report.
Yes, go ahead.
Have another bite. I'm not explaining it very well. If the budget is all about the finances for the years 1 through 5, if that is what we're focusing upon, and the risks attaching to that budget medium-term plan being fulfilled, then it is about concentrating on the threats, the risks to the individual, if you will, line items within those revenue and capital budgets. Councillor English's point was very well made. There are other sorts of risks, which are reputational risks, getting our wrists slapped if we don't have a balanced budget, etc. But I would have thought, and this is very helpful, so please, if I'm the only one, I will certainly be quiet very quickly. But I would have thought this should focus upon the risks, the residual risks, and thank you for clarifying that, the residual risks attaching to the line items within the revenue and capital budget. Will they or will they not materialise?
It is about the budget strategy, in fact. So it's the whole, it's the whole budget process. But to come back to the specific question, which I think was about the individual items in the budget, I've mentioned already the item J about delivery of planned savings. Clearly, there's a whole lot of individual items within that. So this is it's taking quite a high-level view. It's saying, if you look at all of those savings, then there's a risk. Within that, we do look at the individual savings, and there will be some that are more difficult to deliver than others. There's no doubt about it. But the overall picture is the red rating that is shown here.
I think if I can just come in there, the interesting thing is the risk factors that are shown against each of these, where you've got a risk of the impact, a risk level assessment of the impact, and also of the likelihood of it happening. And I think these figures haven't been arrived at easily. I think they've gone through a process of examination at departmental level, I think I'm right in saying, in getting to these figures. I mean, the downside of simplifying the process is you don't get the detail, but the detailed analysis has gone into those, I think, Councillor Cooling.
I fully recognise that. My final comment, if the views on commercialisation are wrong, and you've done your best, if they're wrong and there's no compensation, there will be a hit on failure to deliver a balanced budget. So as you've put into the words, into the briefing, there are couplings here. But I would say that, my final word, A, B and H are derivatives. They're derived from the summation of the risks and other risks and their effect on outcomes. But please, I think that's my final word. I'm getting too strung up on this, I think.
Okay. No comments? No? You'll rest at that, will you? Fine. Councillor Perry, you had something to say.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And I'd like to also say I think it's a very good presentation. It was very clear, I think. But like Councillor Daly and Councillor Walton, it's all about the amber items, really. And the red one is, I think, almost a given. And what did slightly concern me is D, which Councillor Daly quite rightly mentioned, and I think is absolutely right, because changes in economic strategy could have a mega difference, and it's out of our control completely. And I just wanted to make that statement because when we come back to the recommendation on page 18, it says that we should consider the risk assessment of the budget strategy, and I'm not going to question the officers' work on this because clearly they've gone into a lot of detail, but provide appendix A and makes comment or recommendations to the Policy and Resources Committee. And what I would say on this, I think, is I would like to see some sort of health warning on this, because I think there are items in here that really, from a risk perspective, I'm not in a position really to say whether it's a 3 or 2 or agree. And I'm not saying it's wrong, and you have to come up with a figure, and I perfectly understand that. But I do think there is an overall health warning here, because I think some of these are, to say the least, they're in amber, and they are risky in themselves. And there's an element of subjectivity, I suppose, is really what I'm trying to say. And I think we should highlight that, because I think several of us have made this point that there are items in here that are open to, they're out of our control a bit, and we're in a bit of a fog in terms of trying to really assess it. That's all I really wanted to say. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. I can see where you're coming from. How can we respond to the recommendation without more detail, I think is what you're saying. And I wonder whether we really should ask for that detail, or whether we have to have faith in the officers' work. I'll move on for the moment from that. Councillor English, did you have something else to come in?
I'd be delighted to look at the assumptions and the working that officers have looked at, but I suspect that it's probably pretty robust as we stand now, in terms of relationships for today. The difficulty is where we go from here. Is that me? I don't think so.
I hope that doesn't get followed by a tick, 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 bang.
That's not me. Right, ignore that. The question really is how often the updates are done and where they get reported to, because clearly, particularly with D, with government economic policy, it tends to be a rapidly changing situation. And particularly when we're in a challenging and unusual macroeconomic environment. So I suppose the question really is not about what's on the paper here, which I think is about as robust as it's likely to be today, but how we manage the process going forward. I think that's the key, because it will be a rapidly changing process. The only observation I make on the papers here is, for the sake of completeness, under item H, where it refers to section 106, as we are moving ahead with the, one assumes, with the local plan, that probably should be a bleak line seal because the majority of that will not be Section 106, just for a factual point on the paper. I would like to know how this committee in particular will be updated and kept in the loop as the analysis continues.
I think that's a very valid question, and I think we would like to see perhaps a review process throughout the year of the risks as they may change. I don't know if that's built into the procedure, but if not, could it be? And is that a recommendation we could make to P&R?
Certainly, Chairman. I think it makes sense to include that as a recommendation. I suppose the other thing I would say is in relation to government economic policy, clearly we watch out for any announcements that come out of government, and as you know, I brief members as and when new things come out. So when we had the local government finance settlement just before Christmas, I briefed you on the impact of that for the council. So do rest assured we're quick on our feet in responding to new news as it comes through about government economic strategy.
But would you be able to update the matrix that you've got there on a quarterly basis or something like that? Or even at each meeting? We only have a meeting every quarter, don't we? Something like that.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that, Chairman.
Councillor Ravel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, of course, we're guessing, aren't we? But let's say it's educated guessing. But 2016 was not a good year for educated guesses. Let's hope that 2017 will be a much better year for such guessing. Yes. Well, if we knew the result, we wouldn't be guessing, would we? But can I just talk about two items there? D, changes in government economic strategy. I think we're a little bit premature because, in fact, in March we do have the financial statement, which will be a great leader as to where we're going. And it may be you're asking for an update, and I think an update after the Chancellor's statement in March would be very, very helpful. The other one is G, which is commercialisation. The history of local government being involved in commercialisation is distinctly poor. In fact, overall, it's very poor. Now, we may claim to be better in Maidstone, but nevertheless, it is difficult for councillors and officers to be commercial because we're not brought up to be commercial, unfortunately. And I do feel that G should be a little bit more where J is, because I always have a query about officers and councillors being involved in commercial activities, because often they do not cost in their costs properly. They always give you the income, but very rarely do they give you the costs. And that is, my past experience, not in this council, is that that is not usually done very well.
Yes, Councillor. Certainly commercialisation is sometimes a new area for councils, and I'd refer you to the report that went to Policy and Resources Committee in November when we looked at the commercialisation strategy. This council adopted a commercialisation strategy back in 2014, as you all know. In November last year, we reviewed how we were getting on with that, and I think the conclusion was that some of the ideas had been more successful than others, particularly things around property had proved more profitable, and as a result of that, the commercialisation strategy has been refocused around particularly housing and regeneration projects. So I'd like to think that Maidstone is learning the lessons from the experience with commercialisation and mitigating some of those risks that you've referred to.
I don't know if you covered this, but I don't think our commercialisation aspirations are that high, to be honest, in terms of income growth. So perhaps that's taken into account in assessing the risk factor. Okay. Councillor Daly.
Just one final thought, Chairman. I mean, the English language is quite specific, and we're very lucky to have it, aren't we? There's a difference between risk and certainty, isn't there? And risk means that there can be a variation in an outcome. We don't know what that is. And you're making a best guess. Everybody's making a best guess here. And I think that the work that's been done so far shows that all the best guessing that can be done has been taken into account. I think what I'd like to see in our recommendation is that, we've all talked about it really one way or another, is that there's a continuous oversight of the situation as it progresses. We can't do a lot of things. We may hold the most wonderful cards in our hand. Aces can be trumped. I'll leave it there.
Okay, Councillor Daly, thank you. So this time, Councillor Corley, you are waving your red-topped pen and indicating to speak. I took it before, and obviously you weren't. Do go ahead.
I was trying to be too polite to those I thought were ahead of me, but I'll resist that temptation. My compliments again on the diagram and on the description, and I'm guessing that consequences in the table are a descriptor of the impact. But I was just wondering whether members would be assisted if for those risks that were susceptible to the treatment, if there could be a scale of financial impact. For instance, inflation rate prediction out by 1%. I'm assuming you could have a guess, you know when your salary, wage, this, that and the other, and your contractor's cost. Could you get a scale on some of these for, if you got the fees and charges wrong by making this up as I sit here, 5%, 10%, the impact is bang, so that there's a scaler in money terms, which is what this is about, that might assist members to have relativity in mind. Thank you.
I take your point, Mr. Cooling. I think it's quite difficult to do something like this without bringing in a lot of spurious accuracy. I mean, I've seen reports where people have tried to quantify what low, medium and high risk means, and quite often you are just plucking numbers from the air. So I think we've got to think about whether that kind of work would actually yield a commensurate benefit. We could have a go at it, but I'm not sure how much you'd really get out of doing that.
I wouldn't be one of those to use the word fantasy for the later years, but I do have a lot of sympathy with the word. So it is your profession, and please, I do have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying, but you're professionally in the best position to have a feel for the relative scale of these risks. And I think the impact at the bottom, when I look at the words, it would a few of them you've actually said, I think business pool, you've said it's total pool of 60 million. So if you're right by a bit on that, I've got a feel that it could be very big. Maybe the other ones you could actually give an indication, but please, if you think it's a waste of work, then that's the end of my...
Certainly, would be very happy in the next report that I bring to the committee on this to bring in some more figures so people just get an idea of the quantum of the risk. I think that's a sensible idea.
I do. In fact, on the fees and charges, one of the questions I did ask officers was how much of the 16 million is car parking charges, because they're a fairly steady, reliable income, and that immediately reduces the size of the risk if you have that sort of figure available to you. So I think it's that sort of guideline, I think, that would be helpful.
Quickly,
yes, of course.
I think this is probably the best way of putting it with the traffic lights. We know it's a little bit rough and ready, but my own feeling is if you get it right, we as the councillors will take the credit, but if you get it wrong, obviously the officers are at fault.
Thank you for that little insight. I do just have one small query under business rates pool on the description of L. I just don't understand what's written there, where it says members require support from the council. What did you have in mind there that we've got to support you with?
Yes, this is referring to members of the business rates pool, and I don't know if members, councillors here are familiar with how it works, but currently there's 10 district councils around Kent that belong to the business rates pool. If any of those councils fails to collect the level of business rates that the government expects it will, then they can't go to the government and get bailed out by the government safety net. They have to come to other members of the business rates pool. So that's the risk for us, that one of the members of the pool could, for whatever reason, have a hiccup in business rates collection, and we'd have to bail them out. That's what that's about.
Thank you. Okay, one more point, Councillor Morton.
Thank you. That just raised a quick question in my mind, because if I remember rightly, about this time last year, when Aylesford Newsprint went into administration, and that was by a country mile, Tunbridge and Moorland's largest source of business rates. And if I remember, tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Green, the pool came in handy then. And obviously that had an impact on this council and the other 9 contributors as well. So merely sort of as an informal marker for this work going forward, perhaps it would be useful to develop on sort of the detail that we've been talking about before on that particular point, is officers could perhaps ascertain from the other members of the pool if there is another council that does rely on, as Tunbridge and Moorland did, on such a large employer as such for its contributions. I just think, Mr. Chairman, that would be useful going forward, just so that we don't have a situation like 12 months ago.
You could include that as part of the scale of associated with the risk.
Very happy to do that. I mean, on that particular example that you mentioned, the way the business rates pool works is that 10% is set aside as a contingency, and the shortfall in Tunbridge and Moorland could be funded from that 10%. So we were okay that we can give the numbers in the next iteration of this, so you get a feel for what the risk is.
Okay, anything else on that, or can we move to the recommendation that we've got? Okay. Subject to the qualifications that we've made, the recommendation as it stands is that the committee considers the risk assessment of the budget strategy provided and makes comment or recommendations to the P&R committee for consideration on the 15th of February. So are we agreeing we would like to comment, rather than recommend, that an ongoing oversight of the scale? Have you got a form of words, Councillor?
Well, I would just like to say I do think it should be a recommendation, because we're talking about rather than a comment to P&R, and I don't see why it couldn't be, given that the officer said that it could be. That we should be regularly updated on the on the changes to the risk profile.
Well, this is something that our committee has asked for.
Yes.
Rather than the P&R committee asked. So we're really just informing them that taking this as it is.
But we need to make that recommendation ourselves, don't we? Rather, otherwise.
Just add a recommendation.
Yes, but we need, as a committee, to recommend, to resolve ourselves that we are going to receive that report. You don't note something like that. Noting means you don't change a report. You just note what's on the paper. You don't do anything. We have far too many noting recommendations in this council. If we, as a committee, think that it's appropriate to receive regular updates on this issue, we should be saying so, not just as a recommendation, because that's the appropriate thing to do. And yes, that is the appropriate procedural thing to do. And Mr. Green actually said that was that we should have a recommendation. And the comment to P&R is point 2 of any decision.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think we're making terribly heavy weather of this, because I think we all know what we mean. It's just how we say it, to be totally honest. Whether it's a recommendation or a comment is, to an extent, immaterial. I think it is, Councillor English, because ultimately we all know, and we've all discussed and we've all verbally agreed that this come back on a fairly regular basis, and if the officers can provide a form of words that make sure that happens, that's fine. I don't think we should get hung up on whether it's a comment, recommendation or whatever.
Just from a technical point of view, I won't belabour this anymore, but if the committee decides that we should receive something, that is a recommendation for this committee to make a decision. It isn't a comment that can be recorded in a minute. Comments can, I mean, I'm sure our officers wouldn't, but in theory, comments can be ignored and don't lead to results. In theory.
Councillor, let's just hear a form of words and then we can call it whatever we decide we want to call it. Can we do that?
Well, I was saying a recommendation because we're discussing the recommendation. I would propose that this committee formally record that it wishes to receive, regular updates on the changes to the risk profile.
Yes.
Can I perhaps that the committee noted the risk assessment of the budget strategy and wishes to receive regular updates of the matrix at each meeting of the committee due to the change in economic environment, and would also like to receive more information to get some idea of the quantum of risk for each of the areas.
That's fine, as long as we actually record it as a decision rather than just noting, which is point.
Councillor River.
Well, in fact, I mean, I don't agree with all of what's been presented to us. I think, for example, commercialisation is more of a risk than we've actually put in it. But I don't know if I want to argue this case at length now, this evening. I just want to note that the officers have brought this to us. I've read it, I've noted it, and that's it. I don't want to agree with the officers because at the moment I know that certainly almost in my point of view, the government aren't going to put up taxes for the taxpayer at the next March statement by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which will make it more difficult for us. There are lots of factors into this, and I don't want to make a recommendation that I accept that absolutely 100%. I approve of it about 95%, but nevertheless, my feelings on the risk are different to the officers, and I'm sure every one of us have different opinions of what the risk is. The officers have very kindly give us their assessment of what they think the risks are. It doesn't mean to say I've got to agree with that, and I don't think any of us would agree 100%.
Councillor, we're not being asked to agree to it. We're being asked to consider it, which I think we've done at some length.
And I'm just saying that given our united view that we want to do this, I'm quite happy with the words that Debbie said on this specific point, which implies absolutely nothing about the rest of the paper.
So are we agreeing we'll put this forward as a recommendation?
No, we have to agree it for, but we're going to do it for our committee.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just say the word regular isn't particularly explicit. I mean, once every 10 years is regular. So perhaps if we have one brought to every...
I think we said we'd have it at each meeting.
Yeah, that's...
I think that was in the wording.
Was it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
I'll make sure it is.
Thank you. Good.
So this is, let me just be clear, right? This is a recommendation the committee is making for our benefit. But we will make the P&R committee aware of that when they come to consider it. Is that okay? All right? Is that agreed? Agreed? Okay, good. Let's move on.
It was just the one word change to this page 27 to be factually correct. Under planning gain, I wanted to add a bleak sill because the vast majority of that money will not be from 106, it'll be from sill.
Whereabouts was that? Yeah, I'm on page 27. Okay, developer contributions. You want to change that to Can we just take the S106 out? No, okay.
Section 106 stroke C.
Okay, all right. Do we need to record that, Councillor, or are you happy that it's taken?
Well, I'm quite happy that the officers have got that.
You've got that? Yeah. Okay, fine, noted. Okay? Right. Let's move on to item 11, which is the new Treasury Management Strategy you've got in the addition to separate papers that came to you. Okay. Oh, John, are you going to deal with this?
That'd be me, yeah. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
I think I've got it working now. Thank you. Hi there. This report sets out the draft Treasury Management Strategy Statement plus appendices for 2017-18 to be considered by this committee for a recommendation to Council. The strategy is based on a revised capital programme for 2017-18 up to 2020-21, which has been discussed at the Policy and Resources Committee on Wednesday, the 18th of January. So this strategy may be subject to further amendments. Based on the capital programme, the Council are continuing to run down balances to fund this programme until such time that prudential borrowing will be needed. This reflects the advice we have received from our Treasury Management Advisors, Arlene Close. It appears that the Council currently has sufficient reserves to cover capital programme within 2017-18. Borrowing may be required within 2018-19 if the programme runs to plan. Other key points of this strategy are the majority of funds are to be invested short-term, enabled to be available when needed to fund the Council's liabilities. Therefore, longer-term lending limit has now reduced from 8 million down to 5 million. All surplus funds will be within a diversified portfolio of secured and unsecured financial instruments as far as operational demands will allow for this. The expected level of investment income has been revised downwards due to the current interest rate forecast we will receive from our advisors. This is reflected in the revenue budget proposals which are being reported to service committees. Our Treasury Management Advisors have also come back with a further amendment a slight amendment to the revised strategy statement you've got in front of you. Pages 17 and 18, the Treasury Management Strategy, which is your Appendix A. The table for maturity structure of borrowing. When this was first done, it was on the assumption that the Council would probably use 50-year PWLB borrowing. However, our advisors have actually said that there are cheaper ways of funding and we might use some short-term borrowing to fund the capital programme, which we may sort of pay back prior to 50 years. So I will be amending that prior to going to Council. But I don't think it's going to make too much of an issue for next financial year, because even if the capital programme goes to fruition, there won't be any need for borrowing as we have sufficient reserves. Thank you.
Councillor English. Oh, sorry, Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Chairman. This paper demands really a fairly detailed knowledge of Treasury management. I personally am not qualified in any way to deal with this other than to read the papers and to understand what is being said to me by those people who do have that training. So having said that, we are offered 3 options and we're asked to look at option 3. And if I read these papers correctly, this has been looked at by SIPFA, Department for Communities and Local Government. It's been reviewed by the Council's Treasury Management Advisors, and their recommended amendments have been taken into account. Now, under item 5 on page 5, it says that no specific consultation has been undertaken, but the Council's medium-term financial strategy for 2017-18 has been detailed and it has undertaken gone through a detailed consultation. Now, having said all that, I note in Appendix A on page 16 the prognostication of interest rates which appear to be standard and settled for the next 3 years. Whether or not that's accurate, I've got no idea, and unless we live long enough, well, none of us know. But having said what I've said, I will hope that unless anybody on this committee has got the relative qualifications to argue against this, Chairman, I can't really see that we should sit here very much longer. Thank you.
Councillor English.
I would generally agree with Councillor Daly, although my only question really is a procedural one. I mean, I won't go into the details of Treasury Management Strategy. As Councillor Revel said in another context, some of these matters are imponderable and subject to likely changes, but which we can't predict. All I would say is that given the interesting presentation that occurred before this meeting, which was introducing a number of possibly slightly radical approaches to Treasury management, is it likely that there might be an earlier review of this strategy than would otherwise be the case?
Sorry, John, do you want to answer that?
Sorry, I think Mark was going to answer that for me. That's right.
Yes, I'm happy to answer it. There were a number of things, as you say, Councillor, that Alan Close covered, and in particular the idea that it's risky lending to banks on an unsecured basis. There is the flexibility within the Treasury Management Strategy to pursue that recommendation from them, which I think is a very, very good one. So I don't envisage us having to bring a new Treasury Management Strategy to Council during the course of 17-18. I think there's enough flexibility within it to work with Alan Close on their various recommendations.
It's very useful because clearly some of those recommendations are medium to long term, but some of them are shorter term, and they're certainly flagging up some very interesting approaches, which I know from experience in another field with a couple of charities which have done very well out of some of those, which could be potentially very beneficial.
It would be a shame not to have a better understanding of the prudential indicators, as shown on page 28. Could I ask you to go through those in a bit more detail for us?
Yes, sure, Chairman. Page 28. Okay.
28 in the new papers.
Right, okay. The ratio of financial cost to net revenue stream. What that shows is a percentage of interest that would be taken up a part of the net revenue stream, revenue budget. As you can see, 2016-17 and 2018-19, we have more investment interest than we have borrowing interest. So that's a negative percentage. Once we get into 2019-20, 2020-21, that's positive. So we have more borrowing interest that will take up the net revenue budget than investment interest. And below shows the actual monetary amounts relates to that.
So, could you put into context the figure of 2.6% of our revenue budget being spent presumably in interest charges?
Yes, that'd be the net effect of interest borrowing charges and...
I don't know if that's a big figure or it's a moderate figure.
Sorry, the table underneath shows an amount. So underneath the 2.6%, you've actually got a monetary amount, which is £491,000. Net revenue budget's around about 19 million. So.
Sorry, that 491,000. Yeah, okay. But you've just made an important addition of saying what the revenue account is, 19 million.
It's about that.
That's not actually shown on here, is it? Other than the fact that we could deduce that 491,000 is 2.6% of something and do the sums ourselves.
Yeah.
I suppose the question I'm really asking is, do I think that spending 2.6% of our revenue budget on interest is a high risk or a lot? Or, you know, what interpretation do you think you can put on the 2.6%?
If you look at businesses in the commercial sector, then you'd say that 2.6% of turnover as an interest cost is actually a relatively low figure. I think the other thing to say about 2.6% of revenue as interest cost is that what this is doing is funding prudential borrowing, and our prudential borrowing is geared towards investments that are looking to be generating a financial return. So typically housing developments where we can collect rent which will pay off the borrowing. So both because of its overall materiality and because the borrowing is paying for something that will generate us a return, I don't think members need to be too worried about a figure of 2.6% of the budget for interest costs.
You raise another point there, and we have discussed this offline, which is the lag between borrowing the money, building your properties, and getting the income. So it is actually a direct cost, which presumably you can fold up into the income later on. Does your projections, your budget projections, take into account the lag in interest charges you will face before you start getting revenue?
Yes, when we're undertaking prudential borrowing for capital schemes, we will be looking at the, if you like, the time effect of money. So the fact that we're paying up front for the money and only getting the return later on is built into our investment appraisal. So definitely we take into account that time lag in the assessment of any investment that we do.
Okay, so do we need to be unduly concerned then about any of this interest charges if you're saying that they're going to be fully covered by revenue?
No, I don't think you need to, but I think it's worth members being aware of the amount of interest that we pay, and clearly that's the reason when the prudential indicators were designed, whenever it was 10 years or so ago, it was to give members some sort of metric for measuring the interest risk that local authorities are bearing.
And I could understand that if it was a direct cost. Yeah. Okay, is this helping anybody else out there to understand what these factors mean?
I think it's quite useful, Mr. Chairman, but I think we've probably now reached the point where most members now do understand it.
Councillor Cawley.
I'd like to just check a couple of things. By the sound of it, if you're using discounted cash flow or something like that, then that's to be absolutely applauded. 2.6% of revenue budget taken up by interest, I don't think would frighten me at all. May I just ask that the interest, the projected interest payments, they are part of your 5-year revenue budget, are they? I may have missed the line item. They are.
They're factored in to the extent that we're looking for a return from those, but yes, they're built into our projections.
Not into the project projections, but if you're actually postulating you're going to do all this capex, all these projects, I can understand that project by project you will build in the interest payments, discounted cash flow and all that sort of thing. But if that is your projection of capex, are you building into your 5-year revenue cost projections the estimated interest payments that will go alongside those?
Yes, we will do so.
If I may, thank you. That's excellent. The second, 2 more questions, if I may. And I'm not certain I fully digested everything you said, but treasury management is in a sense, it's got a short-term dimension, etc., etc. But on page 3, where you've got the expected borrowing in 17-18 of 0, then 9 and 11 million in the other 2 years, I didn't hear it, and it's maybe because I wasn't paying attention. Do I assume that you're, as the financial environment at the moment is fairly benign, that you're not taking out advance borrowings to have the money sitting there for when these come through? Are you going to wait a bit and see how things evolve, which is the sort of points to the sort of issues that you raised and so on? Are you waiting?
Yes, because borrowing ahead of need, you have problems with cost of carry. You also have counterparty risk. So we will borrow at the time we actually need to borrow. So we'll be running investments down to then.
Final question, and this is loaded from a parish point of view, maybe. On the page 3 of the revised agenda 11, it's got other funding streams, including new homes bonus. Is that the whole of the new homes bonus going into helping to fund capex? The whole of the new homes bonus?
It is, yes. It's been the policy of this council, I believe, for some time to use new homes bonus for capital investment.
Okay, yes, Councillor.
Just got a quick question. 2.1 says the council is required to operate a balanced budget, which broadly means the cash raised during the year will meet its expenditure. The Treasury Management assists the council in achieving this objective. This is all going a bit over my head, but could someone quite simply just say, how does this fit in with our budget savings and our 5-year plan?
It's a big question, but basically... Essentially, what we have to do when we're bringing a budget to council, we have to also bring a treasury management strategy which shows how the budget is to be funded and particularly how the capital programme is to be funded. So come 1st of March, when council approves the budget for the coming year, it'll also be formally signing off on this treasury management strategy. So the two sit alongside one another. You need the treasury management strategy to show how the rest of the council's activities will be funded.
Are you happy? Well, ask another question if you want to.
You'd be surprised how many people are sitting around the table wishing someone else would ask a question.
Okay. Is that you again, Mr. Kuhn, or are you just waving your pen?
No, this is waving my pen to the purpose. Thank you very much. And it's only an observation for those of the members who may be attending the Policy and Resources Committee that on the we've been looking at forward borrowing requirements, and if one looks at the capital programme that committee will be reviewing, a huge number of CapEx items are under Communities, Housing and Environment, Housing and Regeneration Scheme A, B, C, D, E, F. They are huge. And that comes down to the digestibility, the controllability, as we heard in the other room. So would the members of that committee please bear that in mind when they're judging whether the CapEx programme is feasible, and therefore whether the likely funding requirements are highly probable or less probable. And if there isn't such a stress on CapEx from a parish point of view, please ease up on the revenue spending pressure.
Your observations and comments are noted. Okay, let's just look at the recommendation we've got. The committee recommends the adoption of the Treasury Management Strategy for 17-18, attached to Appendix A, subject to potential amendments arising following the approval of the capital programme for 17-18. One was by the P&R Committee on the 18th of January. Now, I beg your pardon? Oh yes, subject to you had a particular change you wanted to make there, didn't you, John?
Just to the table on page 17-18 of Appendix A. What we're doing, we're just spreading the percentage of possible repayment of any loans over years. At the moment, we've got 100% being repaid after 10 years.
Can you just explain where that is in the paper?
Sorry, yeah, page 17 and 18, Chairman.
Well, you said that before, John, and I couldn't find it then.
Appendix A.
Are you on the new papers?
It's actually 24 on the new agenda, but it does say 17 in the bottom right-hand corner on the number.
Is this where you were talking about we weren't going to borrow over 50 years?
Or is it a possibility that we won't borrow over 50 years?
Where's the 50 years mentioned then?
Well, the maturity structure, what it's saying is we've got a lower limit that we could be repaid of the fixed-term borrowing and an upper limit. So that's actually saying 10 years and above, we'll be paying all of it back after that. But it's a possibility we might be paying some back prior to that. So we'll be changing that slightly, percentages.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay,
as I say, I don't think it's going to affect 2017-18
no.
as yet, but future years it will do.
So it's subject to some modification to that table?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. So it's option 3 that you're saying. Now, for those of you who aren't confident about this, one can abstain freely enough. Otherwise, can we agree the recommendation? Okay? Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, we've just got the work programme as the last item on the agenda. Yes, Councillor English.
Because of the slight problem with the papers on the Section 106 agreement we referred to on the minutes, we haven't done the update which was going to be verbally reported to this meeting in relation to whether or not those amounts have been spent. So can I ask that members be not just receive this paper, but actually receive an update about the expenditure of those Section 106 agreements, which we were going to get a verbal update at this meeting, but which probably would be unwise as half of the members haven't had the paperwork.
So you're asking for expenditure?
Well, right, on the papers that most people haven't had related to the Section 106 agreement, it says that there will be an update at this meeting to being the 16th of January, I believe, and to tell us which of those items have had their have spent, which haven't spent, and what's going to be done about it. Clearly, as members haven't generally had the papers, it would be easier, rather than give a verbal update, to circulate members of the committee, including the parish council representatives, to actually tell them what the situation is. I'm particularly interested in the ones that fall in Fant Ward, which I'm sure Councillor Bolton and Councillor Atkinson are also very interested in.
What we've got here so far, like it's simply three of these, one which the balance is outstanding. I think that's what the council is.
Yes. It's not the balance is outstanding, which is fine, which is on the paper, or would be fine if everyone had it. It's the promised update on whether they've been spent or not and what the course of action is that I think members need to have in writing. And then we need to determine, as members, not necessarily of this committee, what's going to be done about it, because these are some significant sums of money which could be spent for the betterment of Fant Ward and Bridge Ward, so they need to be addressed.
Yes, Councillor English, we can go back to officers and make those inquiries and perhaps update the circulated paper with that information. Okay. Well, I only say perhaps because I haven't yet asked the officers for that information, and so I don't want to commit to giving you an answer that I don't myself have, but we will endeavour to do so and report the results as we find to you.
Are we going to circulate these separately? Can I just ask on this schedule, where you've got the spend by date of August 2013, which is long gone, are we still expecting to have the money available?
It would depend upon the precise terms of the agreement. Some of them require repayment, some of them don't. I think if we're already charged with finding more information out about those, we can certainly find out that also.
Okay, fine. We did have a meeting with Russell about the contract project management proposals. Have you got wind of those yet?
Well, there's two parts to that. Firstly is the paper that only I think yourself and Councillor English have, I learned, which does look at the, say, 10 largest contracts by value and sets out the audit response to them. The other arm of that was to consider how we would be examining contract management going forward, and that's something that we'll be bringing forward certainly in the 17-18 audit plan, which you have on your working papers for the next meeting. Will include our consideration of what we intend to do about contract management as part of the regular audit programme.
That's good. That's all I wanted to hear.
May I just check the paper that which most of us haven't seen? If it just lists the contracts, that's fine, but does it actually have a few bullets in there about how the contract is governed, managed, reviewed during its until termination?
The paper, which I did see sort of going around briefly, it summarises to the extent that it lists the contracts and it provides the dates of the most recent internal audit examination of the management of that contract and gives the assurance rating that came from that internal audit report. If members want to see some more detail about what underpins that assurance rating and the reasons that led us to giving it that rating, we can certainly dig out the relevant reports and expand the paper with the summaries much in the manner that you will have seen in our interim and annual reports.
I should wait until I've actually seen it, but I would certainly I would assume any significant contract for the council would have in there regular monitoring reviews with a service provider, and there would presumably be SLAs, service level agreements. Have they generally been met, or have there been significant failures? So I think there are three criteria which probably are taken account of during these occasional reviews, but there should be, in my book, there should be routine reviews of these significant contracts. So when I've seen it, that is what I'm likely to come back with.
I'm sure the subject will recur at a later meeting. Councillor Ingram.
I think, Mr Chairman, that in essence what Councillor Cooling is saying is more or less what is there. The reports are there. It may take a little bit of tracking down and collating, but the reports have been done. Well, some of them have been done, others are planned to be done. So what information it has be useful to see. I mean, might have, given the commercially sensitive nature of some of them, we'll probably have to go into part 2, but nevertheless it'd be very useful for members to see some of that, I think.
Okay. Anybody else got anything to contribute? No? Then I'll declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much.